All right, so let's talk about that Adam Levine situation. So have you been keeping up on the situation at all?
A little bit. I saw
Yeah.
the leaked DMs
Yeah.
of him sliding into random women's inbox. Yes.
Inbox, yeah, and I don't want to get into like gossip or nothing like that. Don't want to talk about something that's not proven. But what's interesting is back in 2009, he did an interview with the Cosmopolitan, I guess, and 5 years before he met his wife, he was asked, "Why do guys cheat?" To which he responded, "Instinctively, monogamy is not in our genetic makeup." And then he said, also, "People cheat. I have cheated, and you know what? There is nothing worse than the feeling of doing it." So this I thought was interesting because a lot of people today will talk about how men aren't wired for monogamy, especially men. There's some books, I think, a book called The Myth of Monogamy, I think, that I read a long time ago, where they say that for all of us, you know what I mean, we're not wired for monogamy. What are your kind of thoughts in that situation? And then we'll parse through some of this.
Yeah, I think this is him attempting to channel his inner Andrew Tate 15 years, 20 years before Andrew Tate was relevant.
Right.
In terms of the monogamy conversation and why it's okay to cheat, and yada, yada, yada. So I think foundationally, monogamy is something that, if you're looking at it from a strictly evolutionary standpoint, is actually hardwired for us. Think about this. The pregnancy requires a lot for a woman's body, the physical. She gets bigger, yada, yada, yada. Then the birth, she could potentially lose her life in the birth. Then the baby doesn't come out fully functioning. We are one of the only species that don't come out fully developed. Like if you see a horse or, I don't know, a gazelle or a deer being born, they come out and they kind of plop and they can move around on all fours. So we're born and we need someone to care for us. So from one standpoint, the pregnancy cost a lot for the woman. From another standpoint, if a man wants to see his DNA and his line continue, he has to be able to provide the provision for the female. So it's actually the opposite. Monogamy isn't just a socially constructed religious thing to keep people in order. Monogamy is actually what's in our hardwired DNA, because if there was no monogamy and a guy can just go sleep with a bunch of different people, if you go back to his presupposition when we were hunters and gatherers in a different species, different time, you wouldn't be able to have your seeds continue growing because those women wouldn't be able to survive through the pregnancy, let alone the birth, let alone what comes after the birth, without a man protecting and providing and all the things that the provision that a man provides. So I actually think that the science is nonsensical junk science. It's not even actual science. Evolutionarily speaking, that is something that we're hardwired to be the opposite, to stick around and make sure that our kids are, first of all, born. Second of all, are able to eat and sustain themselves. And while the woman needs to take a break, right, and say she couldn't hunt or she couldn't gather or whatever, then someone's there for that provision for that family. If we didn't stick around and we weren't monogamous creatures, then we would have more issues and less of our own DNA being passed down.
That makes sense. And two, there's a couple points to that. So one, this is also true with neuroscience and what we discover in neuroscience. And I did a video on this more recently, a video on Kim Kardashian and Pete Davidson on that video. But because they were talking about just hooking up. But if you actually look at the neuroscience, when we have sex, our body releases these chemicals that are used for bonding. Oxytocin and vasopressin. For women, it's more dominant in the oxytocin, I believe. And for men, I think there's more vasopressin. But regardless, these chemicals actually help us with bonding and trust, right? And so when we're looking at when we have sex with people and stuff like this, we're actually forming these bondings for a reason. So it's not natural for us from a neuroscientific standpoint for us to just keep having sex with a bunch of different people, because we're creating these bonds and breaking them and creating the bonds and breaking them. And it makes it harder for us to actually bond with someone in marriage when it comes time for us to have sex with our spouse. So there's that. But you also hear a lot of people talking about how polygamy, I have a family member who said, the whole world our humans were actually made for polygamy, but then religion came and made people feel guilty for polygamy. But I thought about what I pointed out to him too was the fact that when it comes to that topic, like when you trace polygamy back in older civilizations, that's primarily in civilizations where there's a lot of war and stuff, where the male supply was a lot lower. And because when the male supply is a lot lower, then these women still need to have some man to try to provide for them. And so that's where you have the man with multiple women, you know what I mean, rather than multiple women with a man, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I don't know of any societies, as far as I know, I don't think there's any societies where there's multiple women with one man. I mean, multiple men with one woman.
Yeah. Biblically, I've read that the reason why polygamy was allowed was because it was such a patriarchal culture that women, if they weren't married, would either go into some sort of being a servant or a slave, or worse, a prostitute.
Right, that's right.
And so it was almost as if in the Old Testament, God's allowing something to happen because the other alternative would that there would be women slaves and women prostitutes everywhere.
Yeah.
And so her being with a man who had other wives was like the lesser of all the evils, if you will. But it's still outside of the design we see in the Genesis account and what Jesus echoes in the Genesis account, and then obviously what Paul echoes in Ephesians 5 and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and clearly it was never God's purpose for, because too, if you look at it too, like you said, back in Genesis, God wanted for one man to be with one woman. And what you have is a lot of people say, oh, the Bible promotes polygamy. But really what they don't realize too is just because the Bible gives a description of something doesn't mean he's prescripting something, saying that this is how it should be, you know what I mean? Because this was less than optimal. And so we run into that because if you look at everybody in the Bible, when they're in these polygamous relationships, they're having a bad time. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Yeah, they're not having a good time. It's not fun, you know, this thing. Because, I mean, even think, we know how much effort it takes to even, like, you know, keep our wives, you know what I mean?
Just
happy
have
and
a wife
household.
with kids and keep them
right.
happy and stable. Yep.
And imagine, like, having to maintain, like, multiple women. Doesn't sound like a good time. But something else that I found that was interesting about this is how he kind of describes, Adam Levine, how he describes how he thinks that basically it's like this kind of dual nature, kind of like, because on one hand he's saying he thinks that we're not wired for monogamy, you know. He's saying that it's not in our genetic makeup is what he said. But on the other hand, he said he feels awful when you cheat, right? When he cheats. So it's like, that's interesting to me because what then is it that makes him feel bad when he cheats? You know what I mean? It could be a couple things, I suppose. I suppose it could be evolution hardwiring monogamy into us, but then that would refute his first point, you know? Or otherwise it could be that God, we have the natural law, you know what I mean, that God gave us. And so we have this morality that's ingrained to us on a spiritual level. And that's why we feel that tension when we do cheat. What are your kind of thoughts on that?
I think you're totally right. It's a self-contradicting statement. If we're hardwired to do something, why would we feel bad about it?
Yeah.
It's because either we're not hardwired to do something, or maybe men tend to want to have more access to more partners, access to excess, right? And the dopamine rush. But even still, that doesn't mean that that is how you should behave. There's a lot of folks that maybe have a predisposition to addiction or a predisposition to a specific sin. However, we know based on natural law, based on God's law, based on the way we know things should function, that it's actually not in our best interest to be polygamous or polyamorous. I think we instinctually know that, and we try to contort and twist. So in the statement, it's a self-contradicting statement. It doesn't make any sense. If you're hardwired to do something, why would you feel bad? I think the reason why murder is wrong because we're not hardwired to murder people. The reason stealing is wrong is we're not hardwired to steal. It doesn't mean that in our fallen, sinful nature that we still may deal with those things. It just means that we still know that those things are wrong, even if you've never heard of Jesus, even if you've never read the Ten Commandments, you still know these things are wrong.
Yeah, and I think something interesting about that too is like when people give the advice today where they say you should follow your deep desires and your deep intuitions and what feels right to you, these sorts of things too. People don't realize is that we often have a lot of conflicting desires, you know, living within us at the same time. Like even Paul talks like this in like Romans 7, I believe, towards the end of, or at the end of Romans 7. But we have conflicting desires. So it's like to think that you can find yourself by actualizing certain desires, I think is fallacious because you have to say which desires. And then society is going to promote some desires and not promote other desires. But outside of that, what the last thing I kind of wanted to touch on in my mind, I was thinking about how when God tells us these things, like have one wife, you know what I mean? One man with one life, one lifetime. These things are actually good for us. Like we think of them, our sin nature, we start thinking about these things as a punishment. But in reality, like as science even says, these things are far better for us. People who are in monogamous lifelong commitments, they tend to be happier, have happier sex lives, lower rates of depression, do better financially. Then there's a host of other benefits from this. You know what I mean? So we look at it as a punishment when God says you can only have one woman for the rest of your life. But really, we punish ourselves by not listening to what God says. So this was one of many areas in the Bible where I found over, in the last, 10 years of my life or something, constantly it's been reinforced just how good the biblical advice is good for us. It's a healthy blueprint for a mental health. So.
And if we were to flesh out what Adam was saying to its logical conclusion and think that it's just about a man who can provide financially for his kids, then the logical conclusion of what he is saying is what Nick Cannon is experiencing.
That's right. Yeah.
A man with multiple women, multiple children by multiple women across multiple households, and he can't be there in the provisioning side of being a father to all of those children.
Yeah.
So that's the logical conclusion of polyamory, polygamy. I mean, unless you attempt to get everybody in the same house, but I don't even think polygamists are to do that. I think they still have them separated. Like I've seen documentaries about polygamists, and they're like separate houses for separate families. So even if you were to, the way that would even work to be in all your kids' lives, which is a part of provision, would be to have them all in the same house. And come on, you're not going to have 5 wives in the same house. You're not going to have your side piece and your main piece, your wife in the same house. So it's just logically inconsistent. And when you see examples of it, that's why a Nick Cannon looks so ridiculous.
Yeah. And that's the thing too, is like from a purely secular standpoint too, it makes sense why monogamy is better for society as a whole. You know what I mean? Because it's not just about us. When it comes to families and stuff, we tend to think about this is just for us and our family and this sort of thing. But really, when you think about like this serves as the bedrock for society to be able to flourish, because in societies where they do reward monogamous commitments, then these societies as a whole perform better. You have better communities for your kids to be raised in, and all of these. There's all kinds of science to back this, and so that's why I think we should always just keep in mind that when it comes to these things in the Bible that might not make sense to us, we should actually kind of look into it more and think about it more, because as science keeps coming out and as things keep developing, we start realizing more and more that God's plan for us was good all along. So, so now I guess the last thing that I just want to ask is, the next time that you hear someone say that we're designed for polygamy and not monogamy, what are we going to say?
What do you mean?